Russia is overheating. It is not in a good way. And I do think that we are reaching the point of no return for Putin's just domestic options there, right? And Nigeria, the central bank governor, has done what she can, but I think she's running out of options. So I just would love to have your thoughts on sort of the end of the year, but particularly on the Russian and great power political dynamics there.
Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which in my entire career, I'm older than you are, so like decades, has always been a joke. And you know why? It's not that it would be the largest infrastructure project humans have ever undertaken. You know, like natural gas from the Yamal Peninsula in the Arctic to China would be like immense endeavor. It's that the Chinese don't want to put any money in the ground in Russia because they don't believe in it. Chinese disdain for Russia. You know, you think the American liberal elites have disdain. No. The Chinese are dripping with it.
This is the Global Gambit.
But Marko, I've got a follow-on question from that, but I do want to blend it in with my original question, which is sort of the pushback to that would be, but aren't we facing a genuine concern around democratic backsliding? We are seeing authoritative, shall we say, elements growing, populist elements within Western nations, which undermine the bedrock that is democracy. Of course, you can argue that democracy is something that comes and goes, ebbs and flows in its sort of nature, perhaps. But, you know, and as part of that, you know, with the US hegemon maybe not declining in an absolute terms, but relatively, is it declining or is it just simply decentralizing, if that makes sense? And what does that mean for sort of the markets then? If that makes sense, democracy and declining versus decentralization.
Well, yeah, so I think that we can measure backsliding of democracy. It's absolutely happening. I think that in many ways, some countries in the West are choosing to respond to this kind of challenge and this relative decline through abandoning of their democratic norms and values. And I think the US, that's what's happening in many ways. I mean, many in the US believe that the only way to compete with China is to become a little bit like China. The US now has industrial policy. The US now has, political ossification around clear ideologies. It's in many ways kind of, intriguing that that's the choice that it's taking. But I would say that that's happened in the past with many major European countries and Western countries. So if you think about, France has had backsliding on democracy throughout its, last 250-year history. Germany obviously did the same. These are not good. They're not positive. All I'm saying is it's not the end of the West. So there is enough history. If you study going back to ancient Greece, this is what makes the West the West. It is this focus on individual liberty. And that's forgotten off and on, but it always kind of centers itself on that. So I'm not overly concerned. And in fact, one of the things that I tell my clients that when they specifically ask me, what if President Trump wants the third term, to kind of like to action your question, to take it from philosophy to actual events, I think that he would immediately lose that election, because there will be like antibodies of the West will rise up to defeat that challenge. Like that will just not be acceptable in the US. I mean, that's maybe my naive view, but there it is. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is the decentralization. I think that the West is definitely it's starting to adapt to a multipolar world, and the West is no longer a coherent whole. But the reason for that is that China is not a clear rival. And I think this is where I have a much different view from a lot of analysts, especially Western analysts. I just don't think that China has really illustrated itself to be the kind of an enemy that requires circling the wagons. And part of the reason is because they're not, stupid. That's why. Like the Chinese are not stupid people. They're led by policymakers who actually know what they're doing. And because of that, they do not want to create a backlash against their rise that would create a clear bifurcation. And I think this is how very much different Beijing is from Moscow. Moscow clearly went for Ukraine without really thinking about the consequences. The consequences were pretty dire, and I don't think that they were really useful for Russia. But for China, China is much more hesitant because I think China's done the math, and the math is very clear. If you unite Europe, China, Australia, Japan, South Korea, if you unite them in a clear block, it's pretty much game over for anyone on the other side. It just is. Technologically, share of global GDP, share of military spending, share of innovation, demographics. China loses on all of those. And so it would be very, very bad move by China to catalyze that kind of bifurcation, which is why I don't think they will. And as long as China remains sort of like, separate from the West, but not a clear and present danger, it's going to be very difficult for Europe and the US and Canada and Australia to really become a coherent whole, which will continue to look like some sort of decentralization of the Western alliance, which it is, because that's what a multipolar world looks like. It's one where it's very difficult to rally your allies.
I intend to come to Ukraine, Russia in a moment, but on China, obviously, when we discuss great power competition and grand strategy, they are inevitably the primary consideration, but they have a lot of constraints, right? Maybe not ones that you would exactly reference or think of in your writings, but domestic demand, housing market, demographics, a continued perpetual sense of global distrust. Not that people love the United States, right? This is not a sort of everyone loves the US, but there is an unwillingness amongst nation states to get into deeper integration or cooperation in militaristic terms, for example, with the Chinese vis-a-vis America, right? I don't see the Philippines or other nations allowing the Chinese to have an all-out presence with bases X, Y, and Z as America does, right? Again, not necessarily America's approach has been the best, but why is that? And what do you think of these limitations for facing the Chinese? Or is it because they don't think in purely democratic cycles, 4 to 5 years, but longer term, that's a benefit for them?
I think it is a benefit for them, but we overstate it. We often say, China thinks in terms of like 150 years. And sometimes they do still make policy errors. Like, for example, applying zero COVID on the population well beyond what was necessary, I do think was like a mistake. I'm not sure we can explain that through some sort of, deeper perception. But to answer your question, I think China is a threat geopolitically to a lot of its neighbors. So it's difficult for those neighbors to become allied to China. At the same time, so that's like a very American response. Everybody who surrounds China is afraid of China. They'll always be allied with us. Except it's more nuanced than that. Yes, Philippines will not ally itself militarily with China because China in many ways threatens Philippine sovereignty through its statements and actions. On the other hand, trade and economic links are very, very robust. And so there's also a limit to how much many countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia are going to be willing allies of the US. And this is where it's a little bit nuanced. I think that if you go to Indonesia and Malaysia, they don't see the world as bipolar at all. They are very comfortable balancing. On the other hand, I also think that China simply is not thinking about global hegemony today. Now, someone like John Mersheimer would counter and say, yes, that's true, but we have to think about it from an American perspective, that eventually, once they become a regional hegemon, they'll have excess resources to pursue global hegemony. And I'm certainly not going to disagree with the father of offensive realism, so let's leave that aside. My point is just that we're not there yet. We're just not. China has, military installations, broadly speaking. I'm stretching it, but in Djibouti, in Sri Lanka, it has started to create a footprint. It has a military sort of procurement relationship with Pakistan, as everybody now knows. Their fighter jets performed really well against Western technology in this brief skirmish between India and Pakistan. So it has the beginnings of global appetite and tastes, but it still remains a regional hegemon. Where I think China and Russia are different is that I believe China is very self-aware of those limitations and constraints. And it's focused primarily on becoming more sovereign from an economic perspective. So notice how you mentioned the biggest constraint to China is demand. You nailed it. I think that's the number one constraint in China. That and access to energy, which has to transit through Strait of Hormuz, which is controlled by, the America's Fifth Fleet. In other words, American taxpayers are paying taxes to secure Chinese energy supplies. Talking about a paradox in 2025, but that's a fact. I mean, that's a fact. China gets its crude primarily through the Middle East, primarily through shipborne traffic, which is secured by American ships, not Chinese. So, that shows a vulnerability that's, I think, critical, that I think they're trying to overcome through various means, various strategies. EV development is part of that. pipelines to Russia is part of that, all sorts of, having strategic reserve. But the other one is demand. And I think that's the ultimate problem for China. China remains effectively leveraged to global final demand. And they need to boost consumption as share of GDP from current 40%. They hope to do it to 50 in 5 years. But really, until they're like America, and 60-70% of their final demand is domestic, until they're like that, I think they're always going to be very vulnerable to a global alliance against them, which is why I think that they're going to be far more of a good actor than Western propaganda would make you think. So, like, we're constantly inundated with this idea that China is about to do something naughty. And I think that they are very self-aware of why that would be very silly for them. Now, that's not to say that they're nice. It's not to say that the Chinese are necessarily America's friends. I'm not saying that. It's just that they are aware of their constraints. And I don't think that they're looking for an opportunity to catalyze a very clear Western alliance against them.
Yeah, I think you summarize it as a way I thought about it once. Is sort of a lot of academia has often put it that China, we're either in competition with China or in cooperation. I feel it's more loose than cooperation in the sense we're in coordination. We're in coordination in the sense that we both know we've got these big powers. They have to coordinate things to avoid escalation or miscommunication, which is why I think the Chinese balloon, if you want to call it that, from 2 years ago was such a big deal, because it revealed a big miscalculation by the CCP, by the PLA, in a way that we weren't expecting, wouldn't think of as being a characteristic of Chinese strategic decision making. But one last question on this with the sort of the Russian element, which is obviously, I personally, there were two main schools of thought I think I've encountered in my time of studying grand strategy in China as that specific angle, which is sort of that China doesn't want to take over the international order or become the replacement hegemon. And then, it just wants to live within it and be sort of a balancing act. And then they're like, no, it wants to be, much more of the hawks, much more, it wants to destroy the West or the US, etc., etc. Clearly, it sounds like you're more in the former. It just wants to, it's not that interested in trying to be the new America or something. It doesn't mind multi-poles existing, be it Europe or America or the global south more broadly, or whatever it is. Would you agree with that assessment? And also, because I'll caveat it with an example, right? When Russia does things like signing a new partnership with the Iranians or the North Koreans, China's often quite quiet about that, because I don't think they really like it, because Russia, North Korea, these other three, they're often put in the bucket with China like The Economist does or something, the four main autocratic axis, right? China's different, because they benefit from the system as it is. And so I don't think they want to rock the boat as much as the Russians or the Iranians or North Koreans do. Is that a simplistic assessment again, or how do you think this all bleeds in? There is a question in there somewhere. Sorry about the monologue.
No, it's okay. Well, I'll start off. I'll bite off the bit where you kind of put the two typical ways we think of China in the West. One is like, no, China in its entire existence has never tried to go for global hegemony. It's the Middle Empire. It's focused on itself and then its tributary states. That's it, And then the other one is like, no, they want global hegemony. I am an offensive realist. I am from the sort of international relations school of thought. I am a realist. And so I believe that every country does try to secure itself in regional hegemony. And once it achieves that hegemony, it then says, woo, we have all these extra resources because no one's challenging us in our neighborhood. Let's try to become global hegemons. So I agree with sort of the hawks. The China's intentions are ultimately very similar to that of any other country. And part of the reason is that I do think that Napoleon and Napoleonic Wars were really a software update for humans. Every country on the planet downloaded the European-style nationalism patch, if you will, the software patch. Look at Japan. My favorite example is Japan looked around and said, my God, we're screwed. Meiji Restoration comes in. And like this, they go from wearing kimonos and having swords to top hats, monocles, and industrialization, right? So I don't think China's any different. I don't think there's something cultural different in China that makes them less likely to try to go for global hegemony. The reason that I'm saying that they're cautious about it is because, again, they're not stupid. And this is the part where I think American propaganda is sometimes, it's almost like the US desires China to go for glory. Because if it did, it would bite off more than it can chew in 2025. It would give a catalyst for unification of the West in 2025, when West united is absolutely undefeatable by China or Russia and Iran. It's like a joke compared to the West. The West, all of it, Europe, US, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Japan, forget about it. It's game over. And by the way, all the other BRIC countries that don't fall into that, they're not going to go with China and Russia. Are you kidding me? Most of their exports go to the West still today. And they know who's going to win. So this would be a very bad move. And so I don't think that there's this distinction between those two views. I think it's a false distinction. You can think that China is like every other country and desires security for itself, which requires some offense, and also believe at the same time that they're not silly enough to try to pursue it by next Tuesday. And so that's where I fit. That's where I kind of like see where this is. I do think that China benefits, as you said, from the current setup. So why rock the boat, right? So like multipolar world would be great. If I was running China, I would say, look, let's stop antagonizing the Americans. Let's stop antagonizing the West. Let's just focus on our domestic problems, which, as you pointed out, too much debt, not great demographics. This is a 10 to 20 year process. Let's just lay low for 10 to 20 years and then see where we are in 2045. You know, like, why not? That would be the smart thing to do. And I think that they are doing it. On Russia, I think that Russia made a miscalculation. I don't think that it was preordained that Russia needed to invade all of Ukraine. In fact, I'm not quite certain what Putin was thinking, because in 2004, when the Orange Revolution happened, he was far, far more wily, and his return on his investment was immense. He let the pro-Western leadership come into Ukraine. He allowed space for them, and then he used political and economic pressure to ensure that they were failure. Although they were also failures because the leaders of the Orange Revolution, quite frankly, were quite corrupt. But he allowed that process to happen, and then you had a democratic election in which the pro-Russian candidate won, fair and square. So in other words, Putin's thinking after the Orange Revolution was so advanced, so wise, so tempered, and then after the Maidan protests, he, I think, overreacted, and after COVID, I think he just lost the plot. I think there was a lot of domestic political pressure that we don't talk about in the West enough. The 2019 protests were widespread. They weren't just in liberal strongholds like St. Petersburg and Moscow. And I think he's been exporting that domestic unrest into Ukraine because he's far more concerned with the survival of his regime than he is of maximizing Russian power. And that's a fact. And nobody talks about it in the West. In the West, we have two camps, Pyotr. We have the sort of like, Putin is awesome because he's naked on a horse, like just fantasizing that he's just like, he knows what he's doing. Oh, I wish my leader was,
Trump likes that, doesn't he? He idolizes that.
So like, there's that view, but there's also a view that he's like sort of an evil genius. And there's nobody in the West has my view. And my view is that Putin is just a petty, like from the word petit, from the French word petit. He's a petty, domestically oriented, leader. He's focused on staying in power. And so there isn't grand strategy in Ukraine. When he meets with Tucker Carlson and spends 30 minutes talking about Ukrainian history, like it's just a distraction. What he's just trying to do is export domestic instability. And so I think a lot of us try to explain Russian behavior through geopolitics. I know that, John Mersheimer has a very like sort of sophisticated view on how this makes a lot of sense. I just go and I say, like, look, guys, he's just trying to stay in power, and it was just convenient to do so because it doesn't really make any other sense. It certainly does not make Russia more powerful or more secure to have isolated itself. And it has not deepened its relationship with China. It hasn't. I mean, everybody in the West has, again, a very incorrect view that China and Russia are allied. But what kind of an ally is it that doesn't send a single military tool to its supposed friend? I mean, like Americans keep talking about drones or electronics making their way to Russia. Please. If you opened up a Ukrainian drone, what electronics do you think is inside a Ukrainian drone? American electronics? No, it's of course Chinese. Chinese are just selling transistors to whoever's going to take it. Not a single tank, not a single artillery shelf, not a single fighter jet has moved from China to Russia. which tells you that actually this action by Russia did not deepen its strategic relationship with China, and it's just severed itself from the rest of the world. There was another path that Putin could have pursued. If he was truly interested in long-term viability of Russia, what he should have done is he should have said, put a for sale sign right in the middle of Moscow and said, make your pitches, make me a pitch, America, make me a pitch, China, and I'll choose whichever is better. He should have stayed neutral for as long as he can and reaped the benefit of that geopolitical neutrality. India is showing him how that is done.
The strategic autonomy of India, I think, is one of its smartest moves. And, me naively, again, idealistically in my youth, would like to have believed that Russia could have been a bridge, right? I think if Russia had played its cards right, I mean, Putin was sort of doing this in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
He was getting on well with the US, his offer to come to support in light of the 9/11 attacks, but also he was sort of, engaging with this new growing, emboldening China in the form of, the WTO and an emergence onto the world stage like that. But he became, I think, very embroiled by these ideological motivations, this sort of almost an obsession that he wants to reglorify Russia, to reestablish its resurgence as the great power, even though I personally didn't look at Russia, even if it had had a tough time after the Soviet Union, and suddenly think, oh, Russia's a bit insignificant. It's still Russia, right? So I've never fully understood his motivations. But what do you think it means now? Do you think that he just is in whole hog with Ukraine now and he can't get out, regardless of whether it's exporting domestic nationalism or whatever, like instabilities? But what do you think he's trying to do at this point?
Well, I think that there's a moment when your export of domestic instability becomes a source of that instability itself. And so the utility of continuing the military operation in Ukraine collapses. And I think we're near that point. So if you remember, in 2015, Russian-backed rebels basically failed to capture Mariupol. And it was a pretty dramatic defeat. And Putin pivoted 180 degrees to fighting jihadists in Syria. Like that. It happened within days. Like one day, Russian TV is talking about Nazis killing Russians. The very next day, Russian TV is talking about defending West from Islamic jihadists into Syria. And it happened overnight. And everybody in Russia was like, oh yeah, they're what Nazis in Ukraine? No, that was yesterday. Today we're fighting ISIS. And so I always remind my clients of that, because whatever Putin says right now, it can be something completely different tomorrow. It's not like someone's going to hold him accountable. Like no one in Moscow is going to be like, hey, you know what? But what about that other thing we were doing? It's like, Beria's photograph just disappears. So in that way, I think that what he's doing right now, it doesn't matter. I think it's ultimately what can he do over the next 6 months. And I think the problem for Putin is that there's about a third of Donetsk that has not been conquered after 11 years of war. 11 years of war. There's a third of Donetsk that remains in the hands of Ukrainians. This is a political sore point. If you're Vladimir Putin and you're going to create peace in a ceasefire, it doesn't look good that you didn't capture all of Donbass, which is, of course, made up of two oblasts. One is Donetsk, the other one's Luhansk. And so that third of Donetsk is sort of like a little thing stuck in his eye, and he's really trying to conquer it. In other words, it would have been great if President Trump could have been elected 12 months later. Putin needed that extra 12 months. So my low conviction view, just to be clear, because Putin might just be obsessed, as you say, he might just want Kiev, no matter what I think. But I do think that once he manages to capture that or doesn't, I think that's where this delay is. The problem for Putin is that Russians are famously incompetent, famously, historically, when it comes to analyzing American domestic politics. I mean, remember when the Soviet Union thought Kennedy was just a weak womanizer, young guy, we'll push him around, and then we almost had nuclear war because they went after Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that one of the problems that I think Russian leadership is making is they genuinely believe that I think they just read New York Times every morning, and they actually believe that Trump is pro-Russian. And this is the biggest risk to Russia. Because I don't think Donald Trump is pro-Russian. I think Donald Trump is pro-Donald Trump. And he's currently being embarrassed by the Kremlin and Russian leadership because he went out of his way to prove objectivity, to prove that both sides are at fault, as he says, right, about Ukraine, Russia. He went out of his way. He undressed Zelensky in his office for all the world to see. And what did he get in return from the Kremlin? What sign that Putin is open to some sort of negotiations? Nothing. And I think that there's a crackdown coming. I actually, most of my clients in finance don't think so. I think a lot of them believe in the taco trade. Trump always chickens out. They also believe that Trump is not going to go after Putin for some ideological reason. I think they're missing the point. Hell hath no fury like Trump scorned, and he has been embarrassed by President Putin. And so I do think those secondary sanctions are coming. And I do think that the US will use its influence with India, Turkey, China to put pressure on Putin. And effectively, Trump is going to tell him, like, look, man, I don't give a damn about some third of Donetsk I can't even find on a map. Wrap this up. You get neutral Ukraine. You get to keep the territories you conquered. Like, this is a good deal. You're either going to take it or we're going to take it to a next level. And so I do think in the short term, over the next quarters here in 2025, I do think that there could be a serious, I don't want to call it geopolitical, because there's no kinetic element here. Like, Russia and US are not going to go to nuclear war over Ukraine. But I do think that US under Trump could take a much, much more harsher view towards Russia. And I think behind the scenes, China's going to go to Russia and say, like, look, man, we just don't care about your conquest in Ukraine. Like, we're with Americans on this one. Sorry. So we'll stop buying.
No, the very last question I have for you, though, is on this. Like, often we've thought of, I think, although I do consider India in there just because of its demographic size now, but like the triad, right? Russia, America, China. These are the three powers that have, in one way or another, the capacity to influence global geopolitical dynamics in a way that others don't. The European Union is a supranational, but it's not a nation state, right? So I leave it aside. Are we seeing an end of that? Russia is becoming somewhat of a client state to China. Look at the way they've been dealing with the Siberian 2 pipeline. As you say, the sort of growing indifference China has to the whole thing, but also now the Trump effect and the growing pressure. And just generally the economy. Russia is overheating. It is not in a good way. And I do think that we are reaching the point of no return for Putin's just domestic options there, right? And Nigeria, the central bank governor, has done what she can, but I think she's running out of options. So I just would love to have your final thoughts on sort of the end of the year, but particularly on the Russian and great power political dynamics there.
Well, you'll reference very quickly the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which in my entire career, I'm older than you are, so like decades, has always been a joke. And you know why? It's not that it would be the largest infrastructure project humans have ever undertaken. Taking like natural gas from the Yamal Peninsula in the Arctic to China would be like immense endeavor. It's that the Chinese don't want to put any money in the ground in Russia because they don't believe in it. So in many ways, I think that's a great example of Chinese disdain for Russia. You think the American liberal elites have disdain. No. The Chinese are dripping with it. It's like New York Times op-ed pages. They think China that Russia is a complete mess. That's why they don't want to sink $1 trillion, which is how much that pipeline would cost, to link themselves more to Russia. They would rather buy energy over which a sword of Damocles hangs, the American Navy. Like, they would rather buy energy from the Middle East than from Russia. And I think that is a great example of how unreliable Russia has been as an ally, to China at least. So that's the first point. The second point is, you mentioned earlier that you never bought the dichotomy of Russia collapsing in the 90s, Russia being a superpower when it invaded Ukraine. You always had something, well, Russia is just Russia. And I would say that too. I think Russia made a strategic blunder by throwing itself into Ukraine for minimal gain. I mean, Donetsk is like the West Virginia of Europe, and no offense to the mountaineers, but like, we're talking just coal producing region. That's it. Like, it's not like Donetsk has anything of any worth at all. So like, who needs coal? Like, Russia already has coal. You cannot explain to me. I know John Mersheimer would counter that, say, well, it's an important country. You're not getting all of Ukraine. You missed that opportunity. So I would say that Russia is definitely weakened, but it's still going to matter. It can still impact the rest of the world through its energy. It can still impact the rest of the world through its military sales. I just don't think that it's, as you pointed out, as relevant as India or China. I do think those are ascending. I also think there's other countries that are ascending. I think Brazil is ascending, not to the same point, I think, as you would qualify it, as a triad, but I think there's a lot of places. And I think Europe is ascending as well because it's getting a sense of itself. Identity is not formed out of love. In my view, identity is formed out of fear. There are many, many countries that exist today because they feared their neighbors. The United States of America exists because the 13 colonies did not become 13 independent states. They were fully expecting the United Kingdom to come back and reinvade them, which it did. And so they formed a union. Switzerland does not exist because the Swiss love each other. They did so because the cantons were trying to protect themselves from their neighbors, Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire in particular. And so there are these unions that come out of fear. And I think one thing where I would say that maybe I disagree with you a little bit is that I do think Europe is getting to that point and will get to that point over the 10 years. So you've got a world where you've got a China, an India, an emerging Europe as an entity, and then rising Turkey, Brazil, and the US. And I think we're going to live in this world for the next, at least 20 years. And I'm okay with it. Russia, Japan, they're still going to be relevant. They have their own problems, but, they're effectively nuclear powers, Japan included. If Japan wanted a nuclear weapon, it could get it like tomorrow. And so when I look at this world, I think it's a world that's going to be messy, where it's going to be very difficult to align countries. It's going to be issue by issue. Iran and Israel go to war. Countries are going to align one way. There's a conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. Countries might align a different way. So it's not going to be like a Cold War where the Soviet Union and the US would almost always align against one another. It's going to be much messier. And I think for investors, for corporate leaders, for people who just listen to your podcast because they want a career in this industry, I think if you want to get comfortable with this world, just read as much history as you can of the 19th century, because that's where we are in.
Very fascinating. And no, I personally think that we are in a fragmented world. It was like when Macron visited a couple of years ago and President Xi made quite clear he would be pretty welcoming of a European pole, if you like, to balance out against the two poles of what sort of he was saying is the US and the Chinese and maybe Europe. And, while we disagree, I want to believe in Europe. I like to believe in Europe. I just hope that these, 40 plus nations, maybe the Hungaries of the bloc, don't get too sort of fragmented in their approach. But Marko, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for such a wide-ranging conversation. Everyone for watching. If you did enjoy it, do check out Marko's book. It will be in the description. And do be sure to join us next time. And, give this one a share, because I think it's something that a lot more people should listen to. But we'll see you all next time. Take care.